Hi, I'm Tom Shear from Assemblage 23, and we are at the Surley Wench in Tucson, Arizona.
So your musical style has shifted since the earlier days of Contempt and Failure to more of a dance sound and feel, especially on Meta and Compass, and even more so on your newest album, Bruise. Are there any particular influences for your latest album?
I couldn't cite, anything specific that, specific artists that were a huge influence, other than the fact that my musical tastes have just evolved over the years, and I find myself listening to more indie dance and electro house and stuff that's outside of, our quote-unquote scene.
Sure.
And, whatever you're listening to, I think, just invariably has an influence on what you write as a musician. So.
Right. Yeah, it kind of has to.
Yeah.
It's what's in your head currently as you're writing.
Yeah, and I mean that's what songwriting ends up being. Is it's kind of an amalgam of everything that you've consumed as a music listener. So,
right.
Whether you do that consciously or not, that happens.
Right. Okay. So there's usually a 2-year gap between studio albums for you. Do you feel these gaps influence your musical style?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that that's a long period of time, and generally people's musical tastes evolve. But the other thing that I think influences it is that a lot of times after I've finished an album, before I start working on the next one, I'll do remixes for other bands, I'll do production work, and that influences the music as well, because especially when you're doing production for other bands, there's things that they may do that are different from the way that you do things, and it helps you see things from a different perspective, because it's very easy to get kind of tunnel vision into especially if you've been doing it for a long time, as to the way that you do things, and so that can be really refreshing to kind of get yourself out of that kind of rut.
Put yourself in a different headspace before you start writing again. Makes sense. Now, your music often deals with some pretty heavy subject matter. Do you feel that music is a good form of therapy?
Oh yeah, I think it's the best form of therapy. Not just the writing, but the performing as well. The way I always put it is that there's people who pay hundreds of dollars a month to go and talk to a therapist. I'm lucky enough that I get paid to go up and spew out all my problems to a room full of strangers.
Right.
And it's very cathartic, and it helps not have to carry that kind of negativity around inside. To just be able to get it out is very, very satisfying.
So on your new album, Bruise, what were your inspirations for The Last Mistake and The Other Side of the Wall? Can you explain the meanings behind these songs?
Yeah, The Last Mistake was inspired by a case that happened in Washington State, where there was a father, there was a family, and the mother had disappeared, and the father was a person of interest in her disappearance, and as a result, they restricted his access to his children to only supervised visits until they had cleared him.
Sure.
And one day, when the social worker came by with his children, he let them in the house and locked her out, and he blew up the house with himself and his children in it. And so I just thought, what a horrific thing what a horrifically selfish thing for a person to do.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's not, some people have said, well, is that song glorifying that sort of thing? And I think it's important to question, or situations like that tend to be so taboo because of how terrible they are, and people don't want to talk about them.
Right.
But it's just going to keep happening if we don't talk about it. And I think to put yourself in the mindset of somebody that does something like that can be really illuminating, and can give you more insight into why things like that happen. So that was my intention with The Last Mistake. The Other Side of the Wall was actually it was actually inspired by a trailer I saw for a movie, which I can't remember the name of. But it was a Japanese movie, and and it was about a guy who lived next door to this woman who he was in love with, but he couldn't reach out to her.
Right.
And a good portion of the movie is shot from above, where you can see they're just, all that's separating them is this wall in between their apartments. And I thought that was kind of a cool analogy for the barriers, that we face in relationships all the time.
Right.
Whether it's those mental barriers of being too afraid to talk to somebody, or something like that. So that was the inspiration behind that.
Okay. Now, Assemblage 23 has been around for quite a while. What are some of the changes you've seen in the industrial music scene over the years?
I mean, it's changed a lot. When when we put out our first album, it was 1999, and I think the scene was quite a bit. I mean, anything I say is going to sound like the old man telling people to get off their lawn, but it was a bit more varied back then, because you had some of the groups like Formatadre or How Job, who had big exposure and were doing very non-dancey and very technical sort of styles. And then you had the bands like Us and Covenant and V&V that were coming from a more melodic and dance-oriented angle. And now it seems a bit more homogenous to me, where especially in terms of club play, obviously that depends on where you go, but now if you don't sound like Suicide Commando, it's probably not getting on the heavy rotation.
Sure.
So I hope that the pendulum swings back the other way. Not that there's anything wrong with that particular style, but what attracted me to this scene was how wide-reaching and diverse it was at first, and I'd like to see some of that diversity come back.
Yeah.
Back at the end of the 90s, you would go to a club and you would hear bands like How Job and Formatadre mixed up with your And One and your Funk and stuff like that. And it's not quite so widespread anymore in terms of club playlists.
Yeah, so it's not that variety isn't there in the bands, it's just that they don't get the club play they used to.
Yeah, there's plenty of great bands
agree.
still doing those types of music. It's just not as exposed as it used to be.
Right. Now, I've read in previous interviews that you like the movie The Room. Have you heard the Oh Hi Mark riff track version? Do you seek out alternative voice tracks for movies?
I have not heard that one. Although I'm a big Mystery Science Theater fan, and a lot of those the offshoots from that. But yeah, that movie is just it's so unbelievably. It almost doesn't need a commentary track, because you just have to sit and let it wash over you and experience the stupidity firsthand.
Yeah.
But yes, fantastic movie.
Now, you used to play bass in a punk band. Do you still enjoy punk music? What do you think about the direction the punk scene has gone in over the last 20 years?
I've kind of lost touch with it. My punk phase was kind of my angry teenager phase, and as I grew up and got more into electronic music, it's now very hard for me to listen to stuff that's. Part of the appeal of punk was it was so raw and underproduced, and now I really appreciate well-produced, well-mixed stuff. So, but even the newer punk stuff is much better produced than that first wave. But it's always going to be the old school wave of the Clash and Buzzcocks and Circle Jerks and Black Flag and bands like that that'll have a place in my heart.
Yeah. Aside from bass, do you play any other analog instruments?
I play a little bit of guitar, not very much. I mostly like having, a bass and a guitar as if I get stuck writing with keyboard music, because it's hard to explain, but musicians will know what I mean. Like, it's a totally different layout, the way that you produce chords and notes.
Right.
And sometimes that can jog your brain in a creative way to get you out of a block of writer's block or something like that. But keyboards are always where I'm most comfortable.
And on a related note, have you ever played an upright bass?
No, I never have.
No?
And I think that would also mess with my head in a completely different way. But I'd love to. I love the sound of upright bass, but never had the opportunity.
Maybe someday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, A23 becomes a rockabilly band.
Yeah. Now, could you see yourself conducting an orchestra, perhaps a hybrid of analog and electronic music?
I've never really thought about it, but one thing that learning about electronic music that I think isn't necessarily something that you pick up from other types of music is the way to orchestrate a song.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm not using cellos or violas and violins and stuff like that, but it still applies where you have certain bands of frequencies to fill up, and those individual bands give you this big uniform sound.
Sure.
And so that's something I'd like to play with. I mean, I've messed around with doing string parts on Assemblage, like
Right.
30,000 feet, and I don't know I'm sure everything I did is technically incorrect, but I do think that translates in a way,
Yeah.
because you have to think in terms of which space you're filling up and making sure that those parts aren't stepping on one another, ending up in just sonic mud.
Yeah. Waveformless sound is a fantastic resource for the burgeoning electronic musician or electronic musician on a budget. What inspired you to create that site?
Well, I started the blog a few years ago just because I got so many emails from fans. This is one scene where most of the fans also are musicians
Right.
in some form or another. So I was just getting so many questions that I thought, why not just share some of these techniques and stuff like that with a wider audience in one place where people could access it. And then Waveformless Soundware, which is the company I run that sells synth presets,
Right.
just came out of the fact that so much of the market out there in terms of third-party soundware is aimed at very specific genres, and the genres like we're involved in don't get a whole lot of exposure or
Right.
respect. So it was just, I enjoy programming sounds, and I thought, yeah, why not see if other people would be interested in what I'm doing and make a little money doing it. So
That works. Here's a weird one. Would you ever want to be a cyborg if it meant you could substantially increase your longevity?
I don't know. I would have to know what kind of limitations were involved in that, but I do find a lot of like nanotechnology and some of the medical technologies that are being developed now really interesting, not only in the technical sense and what it'll mean for human beings, but the ethical questions that it raises are things that none of us probably thought we would see outside of a science fiction
Right.
movie. So
Yeah.
I think it's a fascinating topic, but I don't even buy like the newest iPhone or whatever. So I'm not an early adopter
Right.
of technology. So I'll
So
let
you'd wait to see how
some other people be the
first gen cyborgs go.
Yeah.
Wait till they work out the bugs, right?
Yeah, I don't want to go rogue or anything.
Yeah. That's all we got. Anything else you'd like to say?
No, just I hope that more people will come out and see us while we're on the road. And thanks to everybody who's come out and supported us so far.